Now we're going to look at factoring completely when you have an expression that has 4 terms in it. And the ideal way to factor this expression, an expression like this, is called grouping. There's different ways to factor, and in this one we're going to actually use grouping. Grouping is something that we'll use when we have 4 terms and we can't pull out a GCF from any of the terms. There is no greatest common factor for the 4 terms here. So what we're going to do is we're going to put these into 2 groups. I'm going to draw my line. And let's see here. What can I factor out of x cubed and x squared? What do they have in common? What is their greatest common factor? And it is x squared. When I factor out an x squared, that leaves me with x plus 1. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. What can I factor out of negative 9x and negative 9? What do they have in common? Well, I can factor out a negative 9, and that will leave me with x plus 1. So now I've grouped these, and I've removed the greatest common factor from each one. So I'm going to follow the same principle I just used here, where I took the common factor out of this group and then I took the common factor out of this group. I am now going to take the common factor out of this group. Both of these terms have an x plus 1 in them, so I'm going to factor out an x plus 1. And when I factor out x plus 1 from this expression, it leaves me with x squared. And when I factor out x plus 1 from this expression, it leaves me with minus 9. Now, normally we'd be done at this point. However, this is factor completely. See, this guy right here is something special. We call it a difference of squares. So this is a difference of squares, and you need to remember to identify these because you need to be able to factor these out when you run into them. So we've got a difference of squares. So the x plus 1 stays, and then I'm going to factor the difference of squares. If you remember difference of squares means that I take the difference of 2 things that are being squared, 2 values being squared. X is being squared, and how did we get 9? Well, that's 3 squared. And then in a difference of squares, you have plus and minus. So for example, if I had x squared minus y squared, the difference of squares says that's going to be x minus y times x plus y. So that's the pattern that you have for the difference of squares. So we're finished here with this particular group. So let's move on to the next one. Let's look at B. So I've got B, and B has 2x cubed plus 6x squared minus 32x minus 96. Once again, I've got 4 terms. I want to see if I can factor anything out from the get-go. And this one, you can do it. You don't have to do it. I'm going to go ahead and factor it out. So the first thing I'm going to do is, what can I factor out? All of these terms have a 2. So I'm going to factor out the 2. That's going to leave me with x cubed plus 3x squared minus 16x minus 48. And that's going to make that easier for me to group. So that 2 is going to stay there. We'll bring it back later. And let's do our grouping. We're going to keep the 2 out here. What do x cubed and x squared have in common? And 3x squared. Well, an x squared. So I'm going to pull an x squared out. That's going to leave me with x plus 3 here. And what do negative 16 and negative 48 have in common? Well, negative 16. So I'm going to pull out a negative 16, and that's going to leave me with x plus 3. Again, remember, leave that, don't forget about that 2. We're going to come back into play soon. So now, what do I have in common between this term and this term? Well, this and this. So I'm going to factor out the x plus 3. And then I'm going to be left with x squared minus 16. And what's still hanging out here in the front? the 2. Okay? So let's look at our previous example. What do you notice about this guy? This is another difference of squares, a difference of 2 squares. It's the same thing as x squared minus 4 squared. So I'm going to have my 2, my x plus 3, and then my x plus 4, and my x minus 4. And I am done. And again, this is because of the difference of squares model. So let's do the last one. And that's going to be C. And C for this section is x cubed minus 5x squared minus 4x plus 20. So I don't have any common factors to pull out like I did at the get-go here. So I'm just going to make my 2 groups. What do x cubed and 5x squared have in common? Well, they've got an x squared. So I can pull out x squared, and that leaves me with x minus 5. What do negative 4x and 20 have in common? Well, I'm going to pull out a negative 4, and I'll leave me with x and then minus 5. Because negative 20 divided by negative 4 is negative 5. We want to make this one match this one. We want to make this one match this one. This one match this one. So now, what do these 2 expressions have in common? Well, I'm going to factor out an x minus 5. So I'm going to take the x minus 5 out, and then that's going to leave me with x squared minus 4. But once again, what do we have? A difference of squares. This is x squared minus 2 squared. So I'm going to take my x minus 5. It's going to stay still. And then my x plus 2 and my x minus 2. And that is your final factored form from grouping. Now, you're not always going to have a difference of squares here. You may just have x minus 3. You just leave it at that. It's not always going to be a difference of squares.